Professor Kennedy is a man of considerable influence, and I'm extremely glad to be able to hand over the dice to him now to speak on innovation, industrial regeneration, and economic growth.
Dear Martin, dear ladies and gentlemen, good evening. I'm happy to join you for this event, and I'm really honored to be invited to give this pre-dinner address. If I were permitted, Martin, to dedicate this lecture to a single person, then it would indeed be to that great and original writer, Corelli Barnett, Bill Barnett, who joins us from deepest, darkest Norfolk tonight. Barnett's classic work, although there's a dispute as to which of his works are the classic, in my view, The Collapse of British Power, came out as long ago as 1972 and has had a seminal importance upon many of my own writings since then and many other people's writings. His book is dense and lengthy, with various complex, interlinked arguments. But one of the greatest and strongest arguments is about the importance of a nation which maintains the culture of industry and production, a country which makes things, a country of entrepreneurs, of designers, of small and medium-sized businesses, of venture capitalists, and strong local banks, and of skilled workers and artisans in all trades. His book really was about the importance of a national economy that works. By implication, it's about national competitiveness, and therefore that means international competitiveness. And that in turn is about our future prosperity, our social fabric, our children's future. It is about our national fate. A people which makes things and sells things, like Switzerland and Korea, gains great benefits. A people which cannot make and sell things, like Rwanda and Yemen, loses, essentially perishes. Can anyone here dispute that statement? Ladies and gentlemen, I should like to divide my remarks this evening into the following 4 parts. First, if you don't mind, indulge me in a personal memoir with some anecdotes. Secondly, some remarks about the reason for Britain's long-term rise. Thirdly, about the nature of the relative decline since World War I. And fourth and finally, about now and the future. First, the memoir. I was born in 1945 into and grew up in a world of great noise and much dirt. At Wallsend upon Tyne, on the north side of the River Tyne in Northumberland, from the 1940s through the 50s and early 60s. My father and my uncles worked in the shipyards as boilermakers, later riveters. They worked for Wallsend Engineering and Slipway Company, which in turn built the engines for the great battleships and ocean liners, Mauritania, etc., that Swan Hunter and Wigan Richardson launched into the Tyne. For cruisers, for smaller merchant ships, later on for oil tankers. It wasn't just people making a big steel hulk. It was about another 500 trades. all sorts of trades. Painters, electricians, machine tools. Almost every one of the young men, my father, some of the younger people in this audience will not believe it, I was forced to leave school at the age of 11 to begin a 7-year apprenticeship, and at the age of 18 he was a fully grown man and a boilermaker. There were designers around. There was a fabulous department of nautical engineering at the University of Newcastle. There were engineers everywhere. There were, I don't know, hundreds of smaller supply companies. The emphasis was on skill, and still more skill. The noise, which I grew up to, was the testing, the 72-hour testing of a new engine, a new turbine engine. Remember, the turbine had been invented on Tyneside. The first vessel was the famous Turbinia. It was a 72-hour thrump to test this new turbine engine just 200 yards away in the Wallsend Slipway and Engineering testing facility. The dirt was everywhere. It just poured out of the sky. Tar, oil, dust. The living conditions were pretty awful. Hard to think about it now. No electricity, no inside toilet, no bath. Obviously no telephone, anything else like that. Gaslight, single coal fire, that's why it was so dusty. But there were jobs. And I think I'm not being too nostalgic in saying there's also a deep satisfaction at making things. And a deep satisfaction among all of those who had supplied the services, whether it was the local bankers with credit, whether it was local design firms. When a ship was launched at Swan Hunters, all the kids at the local schools got the morning off school. So we went to see. There was the thing our fathers had put together. And we looked down through the cross-wired fence and tried to find your Uncle Mick and your Uncle Jim or your dad. This notion of an integrated, productive community was quite astonishing. Upriver were the great armament works of Vickers Armstrong. Downriver, the wonderful long-range trawler fleets of North and South Shields. Across the river, the coalfields of County Durham. Everyone, it seemed, had a trade, as it was called. Most of my generation, my own generation, even then in the late 50s, left school at 15 to be apprenticed to a trade for life. As I said, it was tough, but it was productive. And in my boyhood, living standards for the skilled workers increased beyond all measure. By the early 1960s, social revolution, especially affecting the housewives, which had never before been seen in Britain. Newer, lighter, safer council houses, electric lights, an inside bathroom and toilet, perhaps a washing machine if you saved up. All these were the consequences of a national productivity that had grown and grown with ups and downs and wars and recessions since the 18th century. I'm going to come back at the very end of my remarks to that boyhood memoir and the implications of it. Let me move on to the second point. this prosperity, this busyness, this making things, happened in only a few places in the world, and in Britain before any other places. It had not happened and did not happen anywhere in Asia, the Pacific, Africa, the Middle East, and most of Latin America. Why then did it happen here? This section has to be really brief. This could be I'm sorry to say, Martin, this could be a series of 10 one-hour lectures on the origins of the Industrial Revolution. But consider the following favorable factors, because in the fates of all nations, there is a weighing, a balance, and some are dragged down by having a long list of unfavorable factors: climatic, health, geographic location. Others, a mixture of good and bad. Some, a real long list of long-standing advantages. The first is obviously geography. It's an island nation. It has less need in the wars of Europe that racked the continent from God knows when, but intensified in the 17th century, the 18th century. It had no need for a big, massive army. It could divert more resources for a navy which was itself an enormous job creator. Eric Hobsbawm, the Marxist left-wing critic, in his book Industry and Empire, estimates that by the mid-18th century, the British Admiralty was the largest orderer of manufacturing and the largest employer in all of Western Europe. It was a driver of high technology because you wanted to be ahead of, you wanted to find the longitude clock, you wanted to be ahead of the rival navies. And it was a navy which brought you the feedback loop, the bonus of protecting your trade and your colonies, and in wartime, buggering up everybody else's trade and colonies. So geography, exploited by the second element, that is good governance. After the Glorious Revolution of 1688, the return of a monarchy, but a monarchy anchored in parliamentary controls, there was stable and responsible government across this university. In Christ's College, the master there, J.H. Plum, 30 years ago, wrote a wonderful little piece called The Coming of Stability to 17th and 18th century Britain. Absolutely important. The English Civil War was the last civil war. Compare that with the fate of so many other nations across Europe. Adam Smith, in his classic 1776, The Wealth of Nations, puts it in a lovely way. Of course, Smith is pithy and he's a canny Scots political economist, and you might quibble with the assuredness of his prose. But as I recall the lines, it was, "Nothing more is needed to raise a people from a condition of squalor and poverty to one of prosperity and plenty than the absence of great civil wars, reasonable governance, and predictable taxes." Don't cut yourselves up in religious wars or ideological wars. Don't imagine too much from government, but let's hope there's reasonable governance, and predictable taxes. Parliament, after 1688, decided the budget, not the monarch, therefore different from everywhere else. Parliament hated a national debt. These were proud country squires and merchant traders out of Hull and Bristol and Newcastle and Glasgow, well described by Bill Bonnet. They didn't go into debt themselves, so why should that damn government down there go into debt? Only in the emergency of a great war with France. So you reduced the national debt in peacetime. In fact, you buried it down, you got rid of it, because you then had to raise taxes in wartime to pay for 20 new line of battleships, 50 new frigates. And the ministers were members of Parliament. They had to sit in the Parliament and answer directly to the Parliament. No other country did it this way. Thirdly, that marvelous cluster of institutions and practices that we take for granted now, that emerged at the end of the 17th century. The Bank of England, the bank of last resort, the only creator of valid currency in the kingdom, the London Stock Market, and the Limited Companies Act, the affirmation of contract law, without which business doesn't work, the rise of the country banks able to fund all sorts of entrepreneurs and sometimes oddball ideas and local mining enterprises, local turnpikes, the issuance of government notes guaranteed by Parliament, with interest and capital being paid on time. There were no defaults. Whereas the Bourbon monarchies of France, Spain, and many others across Europe kept defaulting all the time. I don't have to tell businessmen what that means. It means that when those monarchs go back to their bankers asking for further loan because they've got themselves in a further war with Great Britain, they have to pay much, much larger interest rates to get the cash. The British can get the cash at the lowest possible interest rate in the world because they always pay back. In fact, we now know from Riley's wonderful book on the Amsterdam and the Zurich money markets in the 18th century that by the 7 Years' War, canny French investors were buying British government bonds via agents in Zurich because that was a damn sight safer investment than buying your own French government bonds and seeing a default. I think you can see where I'm going now, ladies and gentlemen. I'm not talking about specific inventions, specific advances. I'm not talking about the surge of particular industries. I think we all know what they are. Originally wool and herring and heavy trades, then the cloth trades and the coming of the coal trades, then the extraordinary invention of the steam engine and everything which flows from that. What I'm talking about, what I'm putting my finger on for you tonight, are the incredibly strong structures in which British enterprise and investors could flourish in safety and rising wealth from 1700 to 1914. Many entrepreneurs failed. They failed for the reasons that you're probably so familiar with. Overextension, overambitious, not very well run, a cockeyed idea to begin with. But what this structure did was to give space. It gave room for long-term predictable investment because there weren't Prussian troopers coming down the road, because there wasn't a predatory regime like the Muslim Empire or the Ottoman Empire, because you were protected by the rule of law and by contract law. We take it for granted. We have to fit those pieces of the jigsaw puzzle together, and you have the construct in which sustainable entrepreneurship can try itself out. And many of the original inventions of the Industrial Revolution, which occur from the 1740s onwards, are indeed individual entrepreneurs like Arkwright, who need money from a local county bank, who need advice, who need somebody who will give them a connection in London. But that can be done safely. Nobody knocks on your door at night. How can you be an entrepreneur if you think someone might come and knock on your door and take you away? So that's where I'm going. So many inventions failed, of course, many new enterprises failed, but the torrent of inventions in this period, from the early 1700s up to the First World War, was enormous. Exact instruments, optics, the steam engine, textile machines, wrought iron, the railways, all this made Britain per capita the richest country in the world, instead of being a poor land of sheep and peasants forced to eat, as George Orwell once sarcastically said, a long-standing annual diet of potatoes and herring. Part C, and the relative decline. Well, it also was a result of various causes, not one. When one looks at the economic historians and the technology historians' analysis here, the focus has been over the past many years on the failure of the business community, the resting on your oars syndrome, the staying with the industries of the first industrial revolution, being content with turning out the same sort of product year after year rather than improvement. I think there's a lot in that, and one sees a lot of companies and areas of the economy which steadily go under because of that. But I would again draw your attention to some of the larger structures which began to make the checklist of unfavorable elements somewhat longer than the checklist of the favorable. First, other nations saw what we were doing, copied us. They bought our wealth-creating machines. There had been a ban on the export of textile and other machinery during the Napoleonic Wars and afterwards. And the textile producers of the Midlands and the Northwest wanted to keep that ban. The people who produced textile machine wanted the ban lifted so they could sell more of them to Germany. The textile manufacturers said, well, that means that you'll make profits now, but in 25 years' time, the Germans and the Dutch and the Belgians will be competitive with us at lower wages. The age-old battle about sectors against sectors. So they bought our wealth-creating machines and started to catch up. They modified them, in many cases they improved them. Some of those countries, America, Germany in particular, had considerably larger populations, more natural resources, and the key thing, which Crowley Barnett has pointed to again and again and again, much better technical educational systems. Of course, it wasn't catastrophe. It wasn't the Huns coming in the North Gate of Rome. It wasn't the end of the Third Reich. We were comfortable. We were relatively well off. We kept growing, but they grew faster. It's like the enormously interesting debate in the United States today about America and China. Yes, we're discussing ways of restoring American growth and pulling out of a recession, but China is going to grow twice as fast, at least twice as fast. And you all know what happens in the long-term economic balances when, because of compound interest, what happens when country A grows twice as fast as country B. Secondly, as I said before, we are slow to move from the first industrial revolution, steam, railways, iron, to the second, electronics, chemicals, machine tools, steel. Some firms stayed competitive. Think of Rolls-Royce. Well, a nice story there, despite its falling on its face in the 70s, the sustained high levels of technology, of exact precision tool making. But most didn't. How many of the companies and corporations of 1925, I wonder, are around today? However, and thirdly, this relative decline was masked by the enormous success of the City of London. Banking, overseas investments, insurance, commodity trading. Not making things, but exchanging things and taking your cut. And it certainly didn't help that the social position of the landed gentry of England, of a city banker, of an Inns of Court lawyer, a Oxbridge professor, carried much more prestige than that of a northern industrialist. It didn't help that the educational preferences of the public schools and the ancient universities were far removed from the businessman's needs of new ideas, design, and the training of skilled technical labor. Finally, there was the burden of empire and the cost of 2 world wars, just in the same half-century as an expanded British democracy was demanding social, healthcare, and educational spending. The empire, and here I probably disagree with Bill Barnett, most likely could be paid for. The 2 world wars, fought with such prodigious loss of men, loss of accumulated centuries of capital, and loss of material goods, could not be paid for. No way, except for dependency on America. But all this, and the demands for a fairer, juster British society, broke the camel's back, the camel being the economic competitiveness. National resources now, after the coming of the welfare state, had also to go in another direction, and in very large measure go in another direction. For the political consequences of opposing that were essentially the suicide of your party. This question of allocating national spending resources allows me to slip, I hope fairly easily, into my 4th and final part. Martin's been spent all day checking on the time of everything. If you think about it, ladies and gentlemen, national resources, or the total national economy, or total national wealth, whatever way we describe it, it's like a very, very large pizza pie, or an apple pie, divided into slices, some bigger, some smaller than others. One slice of the pie is the payment of interest on the national debt. The more years of deficit government spending, the bigger the debt bill. the greater the share of the pie has to be allocated to meeting one's responsibility and paying interest on the debt. Right now, in the case of the UK and the United States, and going into the future, the figures are scary. Smith would not have liked to see those figures. Walpole or the younger Pitt would not have liked to see those figures. Mr. Gladstone would have had a heart attack looking at the figures. For good reason. Another slice is defense spending. It actually is now the smallest slice of all, but still large in absolute terms. Of defense spending budget of about $61, $62 billion. But I don't have to tell any one of you here how stretched our armed forces are, especially with the operating costs of current wars. Our capacities don't match our commitments. Sooner or later, one of those will have to give. But the blunt fact is that even if you wielded a big axe over our already overstrained defense expenditures, you would not save very much of the overall pizza pie. The third slice is the biggest of all. Spending on the social fabric of Britain, the health services, education, pensions, the environment. All of these seem to point up. All the fingers point ahead. So my logic chain should be clear to you all. All of the above, paying the national debt interest, paying defence, paying for the social fabric, each one makes sense. But taken together, they increasingly squeeze in the size of the fourth slice of the pie, which I've called here tonight savings and investment. Savings to allow businessmen to borrow at reasonable and productive rates. Investments in more technical education, in infrastructure, in new technology startups, in support services for small businesses wanting to export more. But in particular, in making capital available for entrepreneurs who are starving of it. I'm pretty sure that every one of you has a desire to make fine products and supply fine services. There's a commitment to high quality, to new ideas, and to problem solving. Because of that, I can't come along tonight, Martin, like some management guru and give a lecture called 15 Ways to Improve Your Firm. You know ways of doing it better because you're there. You know ways of how to supply and service and give assistance to small companies because that's your job in the service field, in the accounting field, in the micro-investing field. You know the balance of your strengths and weaknesses. I couldn't help you out. But I can tonight set out what you are doing within this larger picture of how and why Britain became the workshop of the world, and of how and why she has struggled to stay competitive for almost a century now. We as a nation are not down and out, but we certainly look a bit battered. What can businessmen do? It seems to me that in striving to stay competitive, which as I understood it was the inner core of the outer story that I'm trying to tell, in striving to stay competitive, a business or a business group has to work at least two levels. One is the constant search for internal improvements. This is a day and night battle, as you know all too well. How many of you do not work on a weekend? How many of you close the office door at 5 o'clock on a Friday and don't open it until 8:30 on a Monday and do nothing connected with your company or your business in between? 100 years ago, as Bill Barnett knows, the misguided Danish-American sociologist Thorstein Veblen wrote that book called The Problem of the Leisure Classes. I'll use the American pronunciation. The leisure classes were you and me, the people who sometimes don't get to bed before midnight, the people who need Saturday morning to clean up a lot of bills. There are people who don't go fishing. Perhaps we all should do a lot more fly fishing and we feel better with the world, but we don't. It's a day-night battle. You learn from others, you listen to your staff if you're a good manager. Perhaps you bring in a special consultant for IT or for business and supply systems. That's a level which is tough, but I bet most of you think it's manageable. It's manageable because it is in your hands, as the word manageable means. The second level is harder because it's not in your hands, but it involves banding together to make your case clear and more broadly understood. It involves, once again, and you've done a lot of this recently, putting pressure upon MPs and ministers, talking with them, perhaps hoping to get them to visit, getting journalists to visit, getting high school career officers to visit. It involves constant pressure for simpler, predictable taxes. Perhaps we should put Adam Smith's sentence at the entrance through the House of Commons. For simpler, predictable taxes, for less paperwork and stupid regulations, for better public infrastructure, and for central government policies that seek to do a better job in dampening the big fluctuations in interest rates and foreign exchange rates that drive any exporter nuts. It sounds easy, doesn't it? Just do all of that. Yet, as the great German strategic writer von Clausewitz once wrote, everything about strategy is easy. But in wartime, nothing is predictable, and therefore nothing is easy. Staying competitive in our present world of the early 21st century is not easy. Martin, I hope I have fulfilled my charge tonight to talk about business and entrepreneurship, but to put it in a broader setting, hoping to assist you all in thinking about the nature of the problem, what might possibly be done about it. And my reminiscence, ladies and gentlemen, of how Tyneside looked 50 years ago was not irrelevant. When I go back there today, the waters of the Tyne are sparkling. Salmon run up it for the first time in 250 years because there's no heavy industry. The air is clear because there are no factories or chimney smoke. The 23 shipbuilding and engineering companies of the River Tyne, which employed so many thousands of men and sustained their families and gave a stimulus to new trades, new design, new engineering, are gone. There's real social and environmental progress in that story, all right, but it also came at a heavy cost. So I just wonder if we might be able to do it better this time around in the age of the 4th to the 5th Industrial Revolution. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.